Here is Andy Warhol's Marilyn Diptych, and nowhere is the monotonous repetition of commercialization expressed more ironically than in the works of Andy Warhol. Andy Warhol trained as a commercial artist and knew the advertising culture very well. He's going to reinterpret something what's mundane, like you see over here, like a box of Brillo pads, which is basically like a bunch of sponges, and he is going to like show them in a different way. He's really asking us like about our culture. Is our culture really authentic and important? And we are now an industrial culture in which almost everything is made in a factory. And so these are the images of our world, and he just kind of takes them and flips them so that we have to think about them differently. He actually called his workshop the factory. He takes popular items such as Coca-Cola bottles, the famous Campbell's soup cans, and reproduce them using cheap industrial methods, in particular silkscreen. He worked with other mediums too, but most of the pieces and most of the things we think about with Warhol is silkscreen. He refocuses ideas rather than focusing on technique. He did do a sculptural project. He hired carpenters to create plywood boxes that were identical in size and shape to the cardboard cartons used to ship boxes of Brillo pads to supermarkets. Right here. So this is just the outside. I mean, it's a fake box. There's nothing inside. He then silk screened onto the boxes the exact logos and text that appeared on the actual boxes, creating essentially useless replicas of commercial packaging. Then he's going to stack them in a New York gallery and turn it into what looked like a stockroom. This simultaneously pointed to the commercial foundation of the art gallery system and critiques the nature of art in a maneuver very similar to mimicking what Duchamp did with a fountain, meaning how is a box of Brillo pads art? And so he's taking a page from that idea. Now, the Marilyn series that we're seeing, the main piece that we have, it began in 1962 after Marilyn Monroe had died of an accidental drug overdose. And she was considered the most famous woman in America, at least in regards to celebrity culture. She's kind of the first one where paparazzi were all over her, who she barely led a private life at all. And so when she died, it caused a lot of even more interest in her life and her death. And so what he used on the very far left is a famous publicity photograph. He transferred that onto a silk screen. And then he's going to put her characteristics like her hair, eyes, and lips, and he caricatures them by coloring them. So there is paint applied to this to give the brighter yellows, the turquoise, the pinks, the reds on the left-hand side of the diptych. And remember, we've learned about triptychs when we talked about the altarpieces. This one is, since there's two sections, it's a diptych. Okay. On the colored side, the image is reprinted without re-inking it. So by the end, it is going to be a ghostly image of a disappearing person. That diptych format does carry a religious connotation, implying that Marilyn was considered or treated like a goddess or a saint. And so we see lively, happy, beautiful Marilyn Monroe, and then as it progresses, we see her slowly slipping away. And so that's kind of his commentary on Marilyn Monroe. In the same vein, we've got the 16 Jackies from 1964. Both based on 4 press photos from the day that her, 3 of them are for the day that her husband was murdered, and this one is at his funeral. And so they were used by the press over and over again. So Warhol is using what like what past art demanded thought and understanding, advertising and celebrity culture demand immediate attention. It very quickly becomes uninteresting and boring. In keeping with this, he suggested that art should be like movie stars, interesting for 15 minutes. Warhol was kind of the first artist to exploit television and its connection to the consumer culture. With the TV, it allows you to observe the world as a detached voyeur and turn it off whenever you wish. And during this time period, people become desensitized to death and disaster because we see a constant repetition of images on TV, which is only going to get further and further attention and association when we move into the time period of, the movies and that are graphic, and then ultimately video games that are graphic. In both the pieces, the repetitive image and the off-color registers accentuate the dehumanization that occurs when the person is marketed as a product. I have a picture here too, just to show you guys what it looks like. This is at the Tate Modern in London. So here's a few former students that I've had with a picture in front. Here's me in front of it, just to kind of give you guys an idea of the size. There are Marilyns that are just like this piece, just one of these that one of them is surrounded by a gold background. That is in, I believe, the Broad in LA. I've also seen it in a few other modern art museums. And so Andy Warhol is kind of ahead of his time with this. Here's another one of Jackie during the funeral. Here is a piece by, this is a self-portrait of Andy Warhol, and sometimes you'll see this with people doing this with their own photograph. People have kind of mimicked his style. And then even though we're not going to talk about this artist right here, we see it again. We see Andy Warhol being relevant all the way until the 1980s. He actually dies in the early 90s, and he forges this relationship with Jean-Michel Basquiat, who is one of our modern artists that we're not going to get to this year, unfortunately, but 2020. But basically, we see like this would be a silkscreen of what Andy Warhol created, and then this is Basquiat's view on how to alter it. And then same thing, you got the GE logo that Warhol creates, and then Basquiat then adds his style to it. And so here's a double portrait of both of them as well. So it's interesting how Warhol remains relevant from the 1950s all the way in through the late to the 1980s. Okay, there's Andy Warhol.